Hello. So this is radio free VR again. Lance Trexler here. Good afternoon, everybody. I just literally walked in the door, and so I'm going to catch my breath. Ted is doing me the great favor of giving me a cup of black coffee in lieu of an adult beverage, but we'll. I think we've got an interesting topic today. We're going to talk about the criminal justice system and brain injury, which has become a very important topic. And I see that Francis Osborne is on here. Greetings, Francis. I'm delighted that you happen to be on today. We've had the pleasure of collaborating with Francis on some discussions about this in Indiana, and with the Brain Injury Association of Indiana and the HRSA grant. Francis also sits on our leadership board for the HRSA grant. So thank you for being here, Francis. And also housekeeping matters. Please, as you know, or as you may recall, insert questions whenever you want to. I can see them pop up here on Ted's computer screen. So that's great. So anyway, when I see that, where did you go, Cecilia is on here. Great, Cecilia. This the case study is a case we did with you. So that's terrific. I was hoping you'd be on here. Great. And I have Susan Crane with me today, who is our resource facilitator, one of our resource facilitators. I know I was going to say something else, but it just left my consciousness. So again, please ask questions as we move along here. And Ted's got one of these. I'm at his desk today, and he's got multiple screens, so I'm sort of bouncing around. It's everyone knows that I'm really good with technology. So I know where I was going. So this issue of incarceration and brain injury has become a national conversation, and we have, I think, at least 2 HRSA grants out there right now in the country that are explicitly focused on this issue. And we know that this is a growing problem. I can tell you that in the last year alone, I know of 5 patients with trauma, with brain injury, that have landed in the DOC. One of them about 4 or 5 years post-injury, 3 or 4 of them literally within 6 months post-injury. And so this is really a significant concern. To get this started, also to put it in context, I just want to tell you a little case study real quick. We had a gentleman at RHI that had a pretty nasty, in fact, quite nasty traumatic brain injury. And the circumstances of his injury involved an altercation with police, and I think one of the policemen was hurt. It may have been a state policeman, I don't remember. And so, of course, there were charges pending this gentleman. So he spent about a month in Methodist Hospital, had brain surgery, and they had to remove a portion of his skull called a bone flap. And so there was, so then he got medically stabilized and then was transferred over to the hospital at RHI for inpatient rehabilitation, where he had about 3 weeks or 2 weeks of inpatient rehabilitation. And then this guy was transported from RHI to prison without his bone flap having been replaced. So he had no skull on one half of his head, which I thought represented an interesting dilemma for him and an interesting dilemma for the DOC, because obviously with no skull, his brain was, might we say, a little vulnerable. Should something happen in an altercation or a fall or anything really, and so that while that may represent what seems like a an extraordinary circumstance, which indeed it was an extraordinary circumstance, but I think that sort of typifies some of the challenges that the DOC is faced with dealing with in the case of brain injury, and how do they manage those? So anyway, to just sort of put this discussion in that context, the number of people living, or the number of people that are in jail or in the DOC, we'll talk about here in a minute. But of course, the cognitive and behavioral problems that are attendant brain injury affect how they function in prison, just like it affects how people function elsewhere. And secondly, I think it's really important to note that this is going to affect how they function when they're released. And so these are community reentry barriers, if you will, and make the task of people trying to help prevent recidivism even worse. So I think that special interventions are going to be necessary, and that's what's beginning to be addressed in some of these other HRSA grants that have been funded in different states. So according to the CDC, we have 2 million people in U.S. prisons and jails at this point. I think these data are about 1.5 years or 2 years old. It depends on which study you read, but anywhere from 25 to 87% of people that are inmates have a history of head injury or TBI, as compared to 8.5% in the general population. These folks that are prisoners with head injuries have the same set of cognitive and behavioral problems that people in the non-prison settings, such as depression and anxiety. They have substance abuse issues. They have difficulty controlling anger, suicide thoughts and attempts, amongst others. So now all of a sudden, the mental health staff of the DOC is challenged with an entirely new set of problems. Women is certainly an overlooked population, and the epidemiology is scary in this respect. Men continue to outnumber women, but the number of women, I don't know how it is in Indiana, but the number of women in prison has doubled between 1990 and 2000. As of 2005, more than 200,000 women were incarcerated, representing 7%. I didn't put this in this slide, but I read one study a few months ago that demonstrated that 100% of women who were on death row had history of significant brain injury. And I have many feelings about that statistic, and I don't know to the extent that those injuries were part of the defense, but that's another discussion, I guess. And of course, because women convicted with a violent crime have substance abuse issues, they are more likely to have sustained a pre-crime traumatic brain injury, which I think is also true for men. And there's other studies going on, but in fact, these preliminary results may be exactly what I was just referring to a minute ago of the women on death row. Those folks in DOC or in prison with one or more head injuries, and not infrequently it's more than one, have significant higher levels of alcohol and drug abuse pre-incarceration. I saw a presentation done by a researcher in England who is looking at gang violence, head injury, and incarceration. And I also forgot, didn't have time to put that study in here, but what he demonstrated was that 92% of inmates that had been gang members had a history of head injury. And in fact, often that head injury was associated not only with violence, of course, in the gang, but on many occasions it was part of their indoctrination to the gang, that they were assaulted and beat up, and as a consequence sustained a brain injury. So I thought that that was an interesting way to predispose your gang members to more violence and more substance abuse, and that is just give them a head injury. The US Department of Justice reports that 52% of female offenders and 41% of males are under the influence of drugs, alcohol, or both at the time of arrest. So now we have a patient, who's got impaired behavioral control because of their head injury, impaired behavioral control because of drugs and alcohol, or both, at the time of arrest. And 64% of males tested for at least 1 out of 5 illicit drugs. So we'll talk more about that. Okay. So how do TBI-related problems affect prisoners? Well, those of you who have been participating in these probably have a pretty good idea. Memory deficits and forgetting rules is an issue. So often you don't have to be in prison for this to be a problem, but and the case study we're going to do later illustrates this point really well. When you're talking about a person with a brain injury, there is a disconnect, if you will, a dissociation between what the person may intend or mean to do versus what they do. So someone may intend to remember, or they may intend to control their temper. But because of the effects of frontal lobe injuries, that doesn't mean that that's what they do. And so as a consequence, they experience sort of a very terrifying sense of themselves. That is, why is it that I'm doing things that I intend not to do? But anyway, so memory deficits make it difficult to focus on the rules, to follow up with what you're told to do, to respond to directions. Prison guards don't like that. They find that threatening and challenging. Difficulties with anger or irritability or uninhibited impulsive behavior may lead not only to difficulties with the inmate or the patient themselves, but then also lead to altercations with other inmates or officers. And so this is a challenge for the DOC and folks in our jails. And again, slowed verbal or physical responses are often seen as the patient being indifferent or wanting to be uncooperative with directives. And it's not only slowed verbal and physical responses, but brain injury often is associated with attention and concentration deficits. And so if you're having trouble attending to instructions or what the circumstances are or what's going on in the environment, or you're overwhelmed cognitively, then certainly the behaviors of inattentiveness are attributed to as an intentful disregard for what it is that they're supposed to be doing. And which then gets people frustrated with them, which then leads again to their uninhibited irritability and impulsivity. So it's a vicious cycle between them and the people in their environment. There's several screening tools out there. Certainly Francis knows this one. There's a screening tool developed at the Ohio Valley Center for Brain Injury. There was a grant-funded project by NIDER to screen for the presence of brain injury in the DOC. And we just did a initial screening in a population here in Indiana using this instrument um, to begin to take a look at incidence and prevalence of brain injury here in Indiana. But the Ohio Valley scale is probably the most widely used. I've got some samples here of items from that screening form. And actually, there's no reason why this couldn't be used by anybody. If a voc rehab counselor wanted to use this, or anybody else, just as a way to, in your interview, um, um, try and rule out the presence of a head injury, because as you may well know, most people with mild to moderate head injury, and especially if it's been some time ago, may not even think about the fact that their head injury, their history of that is relevant to their disability or their situation. So items like, have you ever been hospitalized or treated in an emergency room? Any childhood injuries that you were told about? Have you ever injured your head or neck in a car accident? It's interesting, if you ask patients, if you ask people, have you ever had a brain injury? They will often, people with mild to moderate injuries will often say, no, I've not had anything like that. And of course, many people don't want to say that they've had a head injury or brain injury. But they literally sometimes don't connect the dots or haven't had enough information during their medical care. Then you get specific with them and you say, well, have you ever injured your head or neck? And all of a sudden they say, oh yeah, I was in a car accident when I was 15 and I was unconscious for an hour and a half. Or have you ever injured your head or neck in a fight or in a fall or being hit by something? Most people know if they've been shot in the head, but this issue of shaken violently, this is where I think I didn't have time to put this data in. I don't think I did anyway. But battered women frequently have a history of multiple mild traumatic brain injuries, mild to moderate traumatic brain injuries, and the number of women where that's not been identified as a problem, that is multiple traumatic brain injuries, of course end up in the DOC. Or have you ever been nearby when an explosion occurred? So this is one of the items that fell out of our work with the vets, of course. So if we take a look at the literature, interestingly, some folks at ISU have done some of this research. What they found was 83% of felons reported a head injury using this instrument that predated their first encounter with the law. And again, here, batters fared worse on 3 neuropsychological indicators. These were folks that were battering spouses or companions, fared worse on neuropsychological indicators of cognitive function than a non-batterer control group. So people that are aggressive have significantly more impairment on neuropsychological studies. It's sometimes described as an acquired sociopathy, and we'll get into this more later. I've always stayed away from that terminology because the judicial system has a bias about sociopathy. Frequently, sociopaths that are not sociopathic behavior that's not associated with head injury often doesn't have a very good prognosis in terms of learning to conform to the expectations or standards or mores of society. But certainly people with frontal lobe injuries can behave in a way that disregards all of those standards. And some people talk about that as an acquired sociopathy. They're associated with ventromedial prefrontal injuries, and we'll dial in on exactly where that is in a minute. So those folks with those kinds of injuries prior to age 8 exhibited recurrent impulsive and aggressive behavior all the way through childhood and into adulthood. And I've had multiple patients that where they were where the it was amazing. I had one case. I think it was from out east. It wasn't Richmond. It was Newcastle. This gentleman had a severe traumatic brain injury when he was age 7. Or no, actually it was age 5 because he hadn't entered first grade yet. And by grade 2, he had been virtually expelled from his school. And literally no one connected the dots between his severe traumatic brain injury at age 5 with his behavior at school. And so he had 6 miserable years of trying to adapt in the school environment before anything happened with that. 14% of subjects in the Vietnam Head Injury Project, I don't know if you folks are familiar with that, there was an incredibly large-scale follow-up of veterans out of the Vietnam theater. And what they found is that 14% of those subjects that had frontal lobe lesions had engaged in fights or damaged property as compared to 4% of the controls without TBI. So there was that connection identified at that time. So these are war-acquired traumatic brain injuries from Vietnam. The neuropsychological data is important in predicting violence. Basically, so if you look at there was a 1-year prospective study of psychiatric patients that were placed in a psychiatric facility after a crime. What they found was that those patients, if you looked at their executive functions or frontal lobe functions, there was a very high correlation. In fact, a prediction equation was developed that you could predict how frequent the aggression would be based on the severity of impairment on these tests. And so there's now we know there's a clear relationship between how patients perform on these neuropsychological measures of prefrontal executive functions and increased antisocial and aggressive behavior. So it's not brain injury itself, but it's very specifically the effects on the frontal lobes. When we look at not only if we look at neuropsychological data, but if we look at EEG data, what we find is this study, they looked at 333 people that were in prison for a violent crime. 57% of them that were classified as habitually aggressive had EEG abnormalities, and of those, 62% of them were frontal lobe abnormalities, and the rest of them were temporal lobe abnormalities. And the reason for that is that both the temporal lobes and the frontal lobes are highly connected with the limbic system being involved in affect expression and emotional expressions, and is really the seat, if you will, of affect. So a temporal lesion or a frontal lobe lesion affects the ability to modulate or regulate those things that are happening in our limbic system. And then one other specific finding, of those that had committed a single aggressive attack, 12% of those had EEG abnormalities in the frontal lobe. So even among patients that are not habitually aggressive, but have a single episode of aggression, had frontal lobe abnormalities on EEG. There is also a body of literature, and again, I didn't have time to insert all of this, and we wouldn't have had time to review all of it, but there is a body of research to suggest that temporal lobe seizures are sometimes associated with aggressive behavior. And I want you to understand the implication of that statement. That is, we often think of a seizure as tonic-clonic movements. A grand mal seizure, someone falls on the floor, they have tonic and clonic movements, and then at some point they become conscious again. Not all patients have that kind of seizure. Some patients have what's called a temporal lobe seizure, or sometimes referred to as a complex partial seizure. These are often not associated with frank loss of consciousness. Moreover, they may be characterized by violent behavior. That is the manifestation of the seizure. So, and these kinds of violent seizure-related behaviors are often associated with temporal lobe, especially mesial and inferior temporal lobe lesions. And what makes it even more difficult for the medical community is that these seizures emanate from deep in the temporal lobe, and therefore surface electrodes may not detect the presence of the seizure in that foci or that location unless that seizure happens to be occurring at that time. And so not many patients are hooked up to EEG machines when they're having aggressive temporal lobe lesions. So it makes it sometimes incredibly difficult to find these seizures. But one of the first things clinically that we should ask when we have a patient with aggression is this a manifestation of a seizure rather than disinhibition of angry feelings? And there's a big difference. So temporal lobe seizures are something that we really need to be aware of and pay attention to. Patients that have had on their injury neuroradiologic evidence of a temporal lobe impairment are, of course, at most risk for temporal lobe seizures. So if you read the CT scan report or their MRI report, and they had a intraparenchymal hemorrhage, or they had significant diffuse axonal injury in mesial temporal lobe, that's the first thing you want to think about if there's a behavioral problem. A lot of times, since we can't detect these with EEG, what we have to do is simply treat them with anticonvulsants and see if their behavior gets better, if their irritability and aggression gets better. If it does, it tells you that either, number one, they had a bipolar disorder before their head injury, and you're treating that accidentally, or secondly, that in fact it was a seizure-related phenomena, and now you're appropriately managing that seizure with an anticonvulsant. So this is an important issue, and it's something that certainly affects our prisoners' behavior and what our DOC is trying to deal with. And then finally, let's take a look at PET scans and MRIs. So PET scans, as you may be aware, as compared to MRI, or most standard MRIs anyway, PET studies are measures of cerebral metabolism. So rather than like a CT scan or an MRI where you're looking at the structure of the brain, with PET studies you're looking at metabolism of the brain. So most PET studies are done based on oxygen utilization or glucose utilization, depending on the exact isotopes that are injected. And sometimes they're resting PET studies, and sometimes they're studies done when the patient is receiving certain kinds of stimuli, visual stimuli or auditory stimuli, or where they're being asked to solve problems and so forth while the scan is being conducted. But most of these studies, they're looking at resting brain metabolism. And what the data clearly show is, as you might predict, is that metabolism is reduced in the prefrontal cortex for patients that have significant problems with aggression. When you look at the MRI that's looking at the structure of the brain as opposed to the metabolism, and now we're getting higher and higher and higher resolution MRIs, and we can quantify the structure, that is, how much tissue is in any one part of the brain. What we find is that after brain injury, the more reduced in size or volume of prefrontal cortex there is, that patient is more likely to be aggressive. So there is indeed now evidence from neuropsychological studies, there's evidence from EEG studies, and there's evidence from MRI and PET scan studies, all pointing towards these prefrontal cortices that we know are so involved in regulation of our behavior. So if there's any questions, please just kick them in, let me know. Oh, it looks like I've got one. Hi, Steve. So he says, I question the quality of healthcare in prison. Are those with TBI being overlooked for the most part? Well, so it's a hugely important question, Steve. And this is why collaborating with the DOC now or beginning some discussions with them has been really exciting. So I don't know that we know if people with TBI are being overlooked. I know that we, to date anyway, we're not routinely screening for TBI in our jails and prisons. We've had some very exciting discussions about what could be the case in terms of providing screening and brain injury association support groups for those folks in prison. We've talked about how to set the stage for discharge or I guess I should say release from, you're not discharged from prison, you're released. What release planning could look like and post-release programs could look like for this population. I think everybody knows that we need to do a better job with this population. And I think everyone knows that it would be associated with some potentially significant cost reductions, just speaking from the economic side of it as well. The Brain Injury Association, I know, has entertained the idea of submitting a HRSA grant in the future in collaboration with the DOC, and I would certainly be very supportive of that. So I don't know. We'll see, Steve. It's a good question. As always, I think there's more for us to do, and yeah. So I hope that answers your question, and if there's anything else, please let me know. But I guess the way I want to summarize this review of the review of these issues is on the next slide, and that is, I think what we see is a vicious cycle, and I think that certainly voc rehab counselors and all of us get involved in the consequences of this brain injury. So we know it's a frontal lobe injury. We know that particularly the mesial and orbital frontal regions of the brain are critical for impulse control. When those are damaged, then people act despite their intellect. They often know when they're doing it that they shouldn't, but can't inhibit it, which leads to, well, gee, I sure would like to have too many drinks, or I sure would like to have some marijuana or cocaine or whatever, or it leads to aggression. And I've seen, and this model is too simple. Sometimes we all lose our tempers periodically. But if you lose your temper because of poor impulse control, and you shouldn't have, and then you feel bad that you did that, and you feel depressed, and your self-esteem is affected by that, then of course the other thing that happens is that people abuse substances as self-medication. So there's an interaction back and forth between aggression and substance abuse that unfortunately is synergistic. So if I feel depressed and embarrassed and ashamed because I was aggressive when I shouldn't have been, and I smoke some dope, then I feel better, at least for a while, until I feel aggressive again. So there's this unfortunate interaction. So this is why we see this triad between problems with the law for aggression in our behavior, problems with the law for substance abuse, and it's associated with this frontal lobe injury. It's mediated by this poor impulse control. This leads to the psychosocial problems, then the legal problems. So now I lose my marriage, I lose my friends, I lose my job. I'm arrested for beating my wife. I get depressed. I use substances, and it's just this vicious cycle of interactions that all originate from this kind of injury. There was a very famous case in the 1800s, and it was the first documented, and I could have put some slides in here on this too. It's a fascinating case story. This guy was working on the railroad in the 1880s in Massachusetts, and his job was to make explosions in the rock. He had to blow out rock so that they could shovel it away and lay down railroad tracks. So old Phineas Gage, as his name was responsible for taking a pipe, if you will, and pounding it down in through the stone so that then they could insert explosives in it to blow the rock apart. Well, Phineas was very obsessive compulsive and very attentive to detail, and as you would want in a person blowing things up around people. And he was a very religious man, and he was a very devoted husband and father. But unfortunately, one day, Phineas was tamping the explosive down in the pipe with what is called a tamping iron. And a tamping iron is about and I've seen this iron, it's on in the museum at Harvard. It's about a 2.5 foot long steel rod that's narrowed on each end. And the tamping rod, when the explosion occurred, sending the tamping rod up through the bottom of his jaw, up into the skull, through his brain, and out the top of the left frontal lobe. And quite remarkably, Phineas survived this event. His skull, by the way, is also on display, I believe, at Harvard. And so what happened over the next 12 months was that Phineas was quite fine with respect to his ambulation, and he was fine with respect to his verbal expressions and so forth. But Phineas Gage became a derelict, as he was described in the case report in the 1880s. He began gambling all of the family's money away. His wife ultimately left him because he was aggressive and abusive to her and the children. He was drinking heavily. Finally, he lost his job, of course. He no longer participated in church. He finally left to whereabouts unknown. At one point ended up in South America for a period of time, and then ultimately died in San Francisco of, I forget how they put it in the case report, it was lovely. He died of consumption, and they weren't talking about tuberculosis, and of syphilis. So Phineas had got himself in a lot of trouble. So this was the first case report, at least in the Western literature, of the effects of frontal lobe injury on behavior. So with that background and that presentation, I want to provide this case study that Susie and I have worked on together. And thank you, Cecilia, for your collaboration on this case as well. I know Susie has really enjoyed that and enjoyed working with you. So this is a gentleman who's Tom. Well, it's not really Tom. Is there a word? Well, Celia will know who we're talking about
I'm
as
sure
soon,
she will.
as soon as we get into this. Yeah, okay. I'm going to move this microphone so Susie can also jump in here as she wants. I'll get this started. Okay, yeah, you do know Celia. Okay, great. Well, we're glad to hear that. Um, we always try to start off with just looking at who is the team because we feel like that the team is what makes this all successful. Um, and that starts off with the family that's now engaged finally, and certainly your collaboration, Cecilia, the job specialist at adult and child job links, yeah, and Susie's role, and this is a case that's been managed here in Indianapolis, obviously by VR counselors. So, Tom, let's first talk about the person. Who is this guy? He's 41. Yeah, he had a history of ADHD prior to his injury. Um, we don't know much about that, and we probably should know more about it because it's probably affecting the expression of his brain injury. I don't know if he was treated with neurostimulants as a child. Susie's shaking her head yes.
He took Ritalin.
He took Ritalin, okay, but for some reason stopped.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's interesting because there is still this myth out there that somehow ADHD magically goes away when you're age 16. If it does, you had your diagnosis wrong in the first place. So he probably should have never stopped, and maybe some of the stuff would have never happened. Oh, sorry. So, Lori is pointing out that my voice has gone away because, yeah, okay. Thank you for pointing that out, Lori. So we had this history of ADHD. So then, from an education perspective, he finished his GED in prison. So this gentleman ended up in prison because he was arrested at age 21. He left high school and was arrested for illegal drug use. 10 years in prison at age 21. It's also remarkable that he had an older brother who died of an overdose. And again, we don't know much about the circumstances there, if that was an accidental overdose or if that was an intentful overdose. He was essentially disowned, if you will, from his parents after his first incarceration. So this guy spends 10 years in jail. Parents are basically done with him. He gets in between, and we'll talk about this in a minute, in between when he left high school and his first arrest at age 21, he did do some, his work was basically of a laborer. He was involved in tennis court construction. And so he gets out of prison. He's been in for 10 years for illegal drug use, and he also apparently made a sale. Well, he didn't routinely did that, but that's what got him. And then a year after his release, he gets this traumatic brain injury, and the circumstances of that are interesting as well. So and again, Susie, please add to this because I know you know things I don't. He is involved in a police chase in October of 2008. He was apparently fleeing arrest, apparently had substances in the car, and I think the idea of being re-incarcerated was less than palatable for him. And of course, then he crashed his car. When he got to the hospital, his drug screen was positive for alcohol, benzos, and cocaine. We don't know exactly how long he was unconscious, but it was clearly a severe traumatic brain injury. And the reason I say that is that he was in post-traumatic confusion or post-traumatic amnesia for at least 6 weeks and maybe longer. So that clearly puts him at a severe injury. He had a left parietal subarachnoid hemorrhage, which is blood that's underneath the arachnoid membrane of the brain. So he's more than likely had some left hemisphere injury associated with that. But he also had diffuse axonal injury throughout his brain. It was particularly noticed in the corpus callosum and in the genui of the corpus callosum. That's a particular part of it. To make matters worse, there was also the question of a possible hypoxic injury or hypoxic encephalopathy on top of the trauma. His airway was occluded by blood at the scene. It took him a long time to get him extricated out of the car, so he probably didn't get enough oxygen acutely. And then secondly, in the hospital, he developed respiratory failure and had some pretty nasty O2 sats for a while. So his brain probably suffered from that as well. He was at Methodist Hospital for a month, which is a long stay, obviously reflecting a severe injury. And then he went to RHI, to the Inpatient Brain Injury Rehabilitation Unit, for 1 month. Because of the circumstances of his injury, when he walked out the door of RHI, he walked into the DOC with severe cognitive and neurobehavioral impairments. So his post-acute rehabilitation was the DOC. That was his rehabilitation. And when you think about that, it really is astounding, the expectation that places on the DOC and the effect on the patient both. Back to your comment earlier, Steve, we really do need to do something about this, because it's an impossible situation for everybody. So with that, now I'm going to turn this over to Susan for her to talk about, get started here on the resource facilitation process and how things evolved.
Okay, I started working with Tom January of 2012. He came to me through VR. Kelly Ashcraft was the counselor at the time, and he was Tom was working with Midtown when I came into the picture, so I didn't have anything to do with setting that up. He was already working with Midtown and PACE to work with his substance abuse treatment and job searches and those types of things. He went through the brain injury coping skills at the Neuro Rehab Center there through RHI. It turned out to be very beneficial for him. That helps them to realize, helps the client to realize why they behave, sometimes why they behave the way they behave, what parts of the brain were affected and why that affects their behavior and perhaps their decision making, and to just kind of give them some knowledge of brain injury itself. He has worked to complete his community service hours, and then he'll have to do that. This year will be his last year to do that. He'll be off probation later this year, so he needs to complete those community service hours. I help to try to set places up for him to go and complete those. It's not really volunteering, it's completing your community service, but he had 125 hours to complete in that. He started to...
Oh, yeah. You just
okay.
push down.
Okay. Yeah, you can go to the next slide. He finished those last year, and we have started to work on those again this year to try to complete those community service hours early so that he can get that out of the way and start the job search.
I can talk about that.
Okay.
So one of the first things that we felt like was important, at least in this case, was to get a neuropsychological examination for him. So Susie and I guess it was Kelly then agreed to go forward with that examination in March. So just want to share with you what his data looked like here. When I interviewed this gentleman, it was fascinating because he was really embarrassed and ashamed of his cognitive impairments. He had been a fellow of average intellectual capacity prior to his trauma. He had a severe traumatic brain injury, as we already discussed. He was aware of his impairments, and came into me just, just clearly ashamed and embarrassed, not knowing what to do with his own functioning. The evaluation, the results were essentially consistent with a severe traumatic brain injury. You can see here the verbal intelligence quotient on the WAIS was 67. His performance intelligence quotient was 67. He was probably in the 100 range, or maybe 90 prior to his injury. And I don't know, I don't have any records. Maybe he was 85, I don't know. But I'm quite sure that he wasn't 67 prior to this injury. His attention and concentration was moderately impaired. He was distractible. His naming was impaired. He had trouble pulling up the names of things, which is common. He had moderate to severe impairment of memory. We gave him one test where you had the opportunity to rehearse the information to be remembered, and he did much better. It was still impaired, but practice and repetition certainly helped him with memory consolidation. But the important issue here, executive functions were moderately impaired. So these frontal lobe functions we've been talking about. As a consequence, he had difficulties with strategy generation. That is, here's a problem in front of you, how are you going to solve it? And so this gentleman is just having difficulties generating strategies because of the frontal lobe impairment. He also had difficulties with what we call set maintenance. So even once he got a strategy down and was solving the problem, he fell out of set. He lost his strategy. He, in essence, forgot his strategy. So now all of a sudden, he's making errors that he wasn't making, but he's just literally forgot how to go about doing this. The other problem, and as VR counselors, folks, you guys, this is an important issue, and one of the reasons also we wanted to do this case. So he's also showing difficulties with planning, organizing, and self-monitoring. And I know I've said this before in these webinars, but maybe some of you weren't on that one. You can wake up in the morning and you can say, I'm going to go to work. And so I'm going to get up an hour beforehand. You're planning now. And I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this. And then I'm going to take this route to get there. And it's going to take me that long to do that because I need to be there by 8. And that's your planning. And so then you organize that in a particular way. You say, okay, well then I'm going to do this first, and I'm going to do this second, I'm going to do this third to execute this task of getting to work on time. Or maybe it's to get to my VR counselor's appointment on time. And then while you're doing that, you're self-monitoring. You're saying, okay, now I've got my shower and my clothes on, and I still have X amount of time, so I'm okay. The problem is with a patient with brain injury, they don't plan, they have impairments of planning, they have impairments of organization, and they have impairments of self-monitoring. So they may say, okay, I'm going to go to my VR counselor's appointment, I'm going to be there 15 minutes early. But they don't lay out a structure or a strategy or a plan to achieve that. They don't organize their behavior in any particular way, and they don't self-monitor. So they'll get up 2 hours in advance. They'll start watching the television show about barracuda fishing in Florida, and they find that quite interesting. And so they end up watching that for 40 minutes, and then they realize, it dawns on them that oh gee, I should have been monitoring. And then they fly around and try and get to function, and of course it doesn't work. And so despite their intent, they may look non-compliant, just like they do in the prisons. It may look like non-compliance, but we have to remember that the organization of behavior emanates from your frontal lobes. And so this is just a critical issue. And I don't want any of us, healthcare providers, rehabilitation professionals, DOC staff, or voc rehab counselors or anybody blaming patients for their disability. The problem is that in the absence of brain injury, we all can do better with respect to how we organize our functioning. But in the presence of brain injury, it's like hemiparesis and blaming the person because they're not organized. The next area where this gentleman had some certain difficulties were with affective disinhibition. And by that I mean when he gets angry, he blows up. It takes very little. It just flies out of his mouth. And so we have this, again, orbital mesial frontal impairment that we've already talked about. And then the other finding on this was that he had a major depressive disorder on board. And again, that all is consistent with his presentation about being embarrassed and ashamed. You know, he has a whole bunch of negative self-talk going on, negative self-attributions. I'm worthless. No one is going to want me. No, I'm not going to succeed. Life is not going to pan out in any way that I can conceive of as desirable. So here's where I just want to give you a quick. I have to show brain pictures. It's obligatory. So because it is, we can't see it. It hides behind our skulls. So these are the frontal lobes. Everything from here forward, all of this. It's a huge portion of the brain in the adult human. This right here is the corpus callosum, to give you a reference point. That's the highway in between the left and the right hemisphere. This is a really important layer of brain. It's called limbic neocortex. It's technically part of the limbic system and involved in emotional experience. And this is the mesial and orbital frontal cortex that we've been talking about. This is where the tamping iron flew through Phineas Gage's brain. Actually, it's kind of on that trajectory right there. And by the way, he was also anosmic. He lost his sense of smell because that's the olfactory bulbs right there. So this part of brain right here, it's right above your eyes actually, is what applies intellect to emotional situations. So you're angry and you're frustrated, but you apply and you know here in your cortex what you should do. And it's in these orbital mesial regions right here where you apply that knowledge to this feeling. And that's where that inhibition occurs. So affective disinhibition occurs as a consequence of injuries to that region. And I see Holly, hi Holly. Holly has a comment or question on here. Unfortunately, our forms list when someone doesn't follow through as failure to cooperate. I often try to change this text on forms going to clients or clarify on the form. This would be a helpful administrative change. Well, that's a very cool point, Holly. And so I don't know who's on here, but I know there are people that could probably help you with that. And if not, I'm sure we can follow, help connect the dots there. I think it's a really good point. At least some clarification of why people fail to cooperate. Yeah, maybe you can get some revision in that sense. Yeah, thank you very much. So this kind of, I just wanted to point this region out because it's so critical for how it is that we function in our day-to-day life. And impairments here can have grave, unpleasant consequences. So I'm going to turn this back over to Susie. Actually, you know what, Susie? Oh, was I? Okay. Mm-hmm. And you know what? This was also this. So these were the results from both the resource facilitation intake and the neuropsychological examination. So one of the things we noticed right away about this guy was his personality, by and large, was very outgoing and pleasant, and despite feeling remorseful about his functioning, his personality was quite outgoing. Ultimately, he had some family support. He did not when he first got engaged in the resource facilitation process, but I'll brag on Susie to say that she really was able to get the family re-involved with this guy, and also provided some education to them about the effects of brain injury, and that helped them kind of understand why he was functioning as he did. Of course, we had Voc Rehab on board already, which was delightful, and initially Kelly, and then ultimately Cecilia's engagement and involvement. We had Susie on board. Ultimately, we got a really good job specialist involved as well from adult and child service job links. Yeah, and this guy really wants to do well, and so those were strengths certainly. The challenges in this situation were that he had this frontal lobe impairment that we've been talking about. There was this dissociation, there still is, this dissociation of intent and behavior. So he wants to do well, but has difficulty carrying it out. We talked about the cognitive impairments already. The functional day-to-day consequences that he makes poor choices, and still. And he's at risk of repeating some behaviors that, like substance abuse, he's still at times vulnerable to being tempted into that, and he has trouble inhibiting, despite the facts that he knows he shouldn't. And we had the depression. The other issue is that because of the circumstances of his injury, he is dependent for transportation and is not going to be driving until 2014. So that's kind of an overview of the findings there. So this has got a lot of data on it, but I'm going to turn it over to Susie. Yeah, and just push down on that.
Okay. Well, as we talked about, the family, when I came on board, was not involved. They had pretty much washed their hands of him, tired of his repeat behaviors and not understanding his ability to be able to control that. He was involved in a church and very involved with a pastor who he considered a good friend at the time I came on board. In the past, probably 6 months or less, his mother and father both came on board, and his dad has been helping him more in taking him places, doing things with him. Started out when he was going to do the brain injury coping skills. His dad was going to come with him, and he was on board and all ready to start, and then last minute backed out, so that was kind of devastating in the beginning. But Tom went ahead and completed that program. We had the VRBI specialist, of course, that support, and they helped with support with the testing, and then the adding the resource facilitation, helping with transportation, and that screen needs to be turned just a little. I can't read those. Helping with conferences and those things. We've had conferences to meet and sit down and discuss Tom face-to-face so that we can all know what we're doing and be on the same page.
I just want to add a comment to that, too. I think that, Celia, that's a huge contribution, and I think that that kind of collaboration and teamwork is exactly the point, because it's resource facilitation, I think, works because it facilitates integration and coordination of resources. So when you and the job specialist and Susie and the client are all sitting there together talking about what's going on, where you are, where you're going, that's the kind of structure that a patient with brain injury needs because of the cognitive and the frontal lobe deficits. And so the more integration and the more collaboration and the more structure that team can pull together for that patient, the more likely they are to succeed. So I think that I would urge as much as you can. I know everyone's stretched for time, but for those patients where you really want to drill down, getting that kind of case conference pulled together is hugely useful. I've been a part of some of those in the past, and they make a difference in terms of outcome. So I just wanted to add that. Yeah.
And I might add too, in the previous slides, Dr. Trexler talked about, the patient getting prepared and organizing their day. The funny thing about Tom is he really does make it to his appointments on time. Actually, he's usually early, and then he's so frustrated by the appointment time because everybody else is on time instead of early that it leads to some problem behaviorally. He comes across as very impatient, very short in his talking, and very impatient because he's been there for 15 minutes even though he was early, and the doctor does happen to be on time, but that doesn't usually come across very well. So that's a little bit different in his behavior. We now have a very involved job specialist on board. In the past, he had a job specialist that really didn't understand brain injury, and that was quite a problem. Again, with the compliancy, they took it as he just didn't want to be compliant because he didn't do what he was supposed to do. He wasn't there when he was supposed to be. They thought that when he had an excuse, it was a lie and didn't trust him, and so things just got really ugly. In the beginning, when I met with that job specialist, things were not good at all. And so we finally were able to switch him to a different job specialist, and that has worked out very well. She works very well with him. And Shell says, I don't understand, at what point did VR become involved? Pre or posting? It was after he got out. As far as I know, it was after he got out of this last time he was incarcerated, after the car accident, after he had received the brain injury. Hope that answers that. As far as resource facilitation, some of the things that we were able to do together, I work with the job specialist and the VR counselor very closely. We keep in contact a lot to, let each other know when we get a little worried that things aren't going well or that there might be a problem. We try to stay on top of those. Helped Tom apply and obtain his Medicaid, which was a long process. We started that last year. It took probably 9 months. All his paperwork was in. They lost it because they moved offices. So, of course, that was our fault. So we had to start all over. And once he was approved, it took another 3 months to get his Medicaid card. So without that card, it's a little hard to get into any facility to see doctors and those types of things. When he did first start his community service, I was able to go to Goodwill and shadow to kind of watch, to observe and see how he did, to make sure that he was doing what he was supposed to do and try to help him be successful in that area. As Dr. Trexler had said, I educated the family to try to explain some of his behaviors. I've helped with making sure that his transportation, bus passes are kept up and those things. That is his only way of getting around. As I said, his dad sometimes will take him, but I don't depend on that because that can change. He completed the BICS program, and we recently got him into a physician. I found a physician I was hoping that would help to prescribe and manage medication, but this particular physician is not he's not too big on prescribing medication, so he's trying some other routes, and then if that doesn't work, we'll go the medication route. But we may look into trying to find some different physicians for that. I'm not sure that that's going to be successful. Is there a resource facilitation that covers Clark, Floyd, Harrison, Scott County area? There's a map of I'm not sure what region of the state that is in. I think it's down in the southern part. Maybe, yeah, is that clear down in the southern part? Is that Floyd at the very tip?
Yes.
And at this time, no, there is not. We have someone that covers the Bloomington area and a little bit further south in that area, but right now there is not someone that is all the way down that far. I'm sorry. And to kind of complete with my work with Tom, he was able to get his SSI, and so then he was able to get his own apartment. He, at the time that I met him, was living with his then fiance, which was abusive, and so that was not a good situation for him to be in. He now lives independently in his own apartment, so we were able to get him in that, and now he's much happier that way.
So also, did you talk about
Mm-hmm. Talked about, I'm sorry. The employment specialist, we talked about, I kind of talked about her. She was able to, the employment specialist was able to get him placed into Goodwill to start with a community service, and then that ultimately ended in, or became a job for him. They hired him. That's one of the programs they have. She is working on getting him set up with the drug rehab programs that he needs to complete for the probation purposes. He ultimately ended up losing that job that he had, so she is now going to be working with him on helping him to find a new job and helping him refer him to the PACE program, which helps those who have been incarcerated, helps them find employment. They typically have better luck in knowing what employers will work with people who have a record. Does that cover that? We talked about his employment history before. He had worked as a laborer for about a year and then completed his community service hours, which worked into a job. And then he kept that job for 4 months and was actually pretty successful. And then because of a poor decision, lost that job.
So, and the nature of that decision, so it's whether or not, it's hard to tell whether it was a memory error or if it was an executive function frontal lobe error. But clearly this guy lost his job because of the effects of his brain injury. And so Susie and I were talking about, well, what are the next steps with this guy in terms of just helping him. He's now got Medicaid finally. So we'll be able to access some rehabilitation services potentially that he hasn't had access to before. I think the other thing is if we can get him engaged in some appropriate, because as we know, his post-acute rehabilitation was DOC, not outpatient therapies.
Well, and also some of the rehabilitation he had as far as for cognitive has been through the mental health system, which treats that differently than what brain injury rehabilitation treats it.
So collaboration with PACE will be important in that respect so that they can also understand the effects of brain injury as it relates to then their work with him from a reentry, offender reentry perspective. So, okay, so hi Cecilia, how can you differentiate between decisions made from TBI and decisions made from substance abuse? When this incident happened, I wondered if he was using again. Well, I think it's a really good question.
I think in his case, we can be somewhat assured that he is not using again because he is still having to go to the probation officer for drug testing. Otherwise, yeah, I might have thought that's a possibility. And he has used since while he's been on parole, so that's not out of the question.
And the other thing is, what the research shows on substance abuse is that, of course, too much alcohol and, of course, too much marijuana and too much anything can be deleterious to your cognitive functioning. But it takes a lot of it, and it takes a lot of it repetitively. So, and of course, there are individual differences in that. So in the case of both marijuana and worse is alcohol on the effects on memory, there's a condition called Korsakoff's disease, and it's a severe impairment of memory that's associated with drinking way too much. And there can be more subtle effects on memory with alcohol or marijuana use. Marijuana use, frequent, repetitive, heavy marijuana use, is associated with memory impairment. But you've really got to be knocking it down to really have a day-to-day effect on your cognitive functioning. Celia's got a comment here. It seems tricky to know. I'm glad he is in treatment. I think that is critical. No, you're absolutely right, Cecilia. And I think, this guy's got 1 foot on solid ground, but we still got another foot to get on ground. So I think you're absolutely right. So challenges along the way.
Well, as we've kind of talked about, poor decision making. He plans to make the right decisions. He thinks he is. He tries, and it just doesn't always turn out in his best interest. As I said, he's very anxious and restless. A phone conversation with him is very difficult, and that tends to be the way that we communicate a lot of times. The VR counselor and Tom, and myself and Tom, and the job coach and Tom. He wants to be on the phone about 2 minutes, but then he also remembers things that he forgot to ask because he didn't stay on the phone long enough, so he can call several times a day. One of the things that I've done with him and with a lot of my clients, is to help them. They'll call me a lot of times and ask me to call, but by the time I get back to calling them, no matter what the time frame, they've forgotten. So I've asked them when they leave their voicemail to tell me what they're calling about, so then we can kind of review that and I know what they wanted.
So and I'm just going to add to that. So when, Susie and I were talking earlier, I think this is one of the reasons that we've got to, now that he does have Medicaid, look at the possibility of some cognitive rehabilitation, because this guy never had the opportunity to get memory rehabilitation strategies. He doesn't know how to keep a memory notebook. He doesn't know how to organize his behavior. And so that's affecting his day-to-day functioning. I think he also, for this difficulty with respect to perhaps making some bad decisions is obviously related to the fact that he hasn't had any kind of group or individual rehabilitative intervention for those neurobehavioral problems. So,
and his logic reasoning isn't, of course, the same as ours. If somebody, if he needs to do something for somebody, or he has something he wants to do, then that usually prioritizes over a meeting that he has scheduled with me or VR, something like that. So he has no reasoning when it comes to prioritizing or making decisions, and that a lot of times gets in the way. Cecilia says he would have never gotten as far as he had without resource facilitation. He would have likely gone back to jail without Susie's intervention. Thank you, Cecilia. That was also on behalf of Dr. Backhouse of our office. I'll interject. I think we have a slide maybe later that points that out. Because he did test positive to marijuana, he was back before the judge again, and I was able to get Dr. Backhouse to write a letter on his behalf and take that to the court and submit that to be seen by the judge, explaining, his problems of decision making and due to the brain injury. So ultimately, the judge released him to be back out in the community. That's happened twice since I've worked with him, but because of that, we're able to intervene and help keep him out of jail, because that's the last thing he needs is to go back in prison. Some of the successes along the way, he's completed his community service hours for last year, and of course has to do that again this year. He is working on his drug programs. He's had negative drug tests, to my knowledge, and we keep in close contact with his probation officer also. He did maintain employment for a short time, and they were very happy with his employment, so that gives us hope that he is able to maintain employment once he gets it and gets those strategies in place. He wants so much to make his parents proud, to make people proud of him. He, as Dr. Trexler had mentioned, he is ashamed of what he's done in the past and his past behaviors, and he really wants to change that and be successful. And we don't always find that in people. Sometimes they aren't ashamed. They don't have any recourse for how they behave, but he really does want to be successful.
And I want to say something about that. So what Susie just said is hugely important. So we talked earlier about this issue of frontal lobe impairment and quote, sociopathy, end quote. So a true sociopath doesn't feel sorry for anything. A patient with a brain injury who does impulsive things feels ashamed and embarrassed. And so that's the difference between a psychiatric diagnosis and a neurologic diagnosis. And so that kind of distinction, making that kind of distinction is a huge issue in terms of how you manage the patient. So just want to throw that in there.
And I think sometimes why these clients can seem non-compliant is from all aspects of watching them and seeing them navigate, some things. He navigates the public transportation very well. And so when you see these things, he appears normal, what we would consider normal. And so when he has these non-compliant behaviors, then that's what it's considered as, rather than thinking that it was due to his brain injury that he's behaving the way he is. They think, everybody, especially I found in the mental health system when I worked with that particular mental health place, they felt he was non-compliant just because, everything else about him appeared normal. And so that had to be that he just didn't want to come to the meetings. He just didn't want to complete the classes. So that's where we kind of butted heads in the beginning, but now we're set in a different area, so I think he has a better chance of succeeding with that. He does live in his own apartment now. That's a good situation for him to get out of the abusive then fiance situation. That, for him to get out of that and to have his own apartment, that's a success for him. He feels proud of that. Even though he knows he's not in the best of neighborhoods and he's not crazy about where he lives, but at least he has his own apartment in his own place. As I said, he was successful in getting SSI. His mom is in charge of that and manages his money for him. She does give him money each week, and he's in charge of that. Because of his drug charge, he doesn't get food stamps, so he has to manage that money to buy his groceries and those types of things. He does navigate the city bus system very well. Family does take him some, but it's mainly through city transportation that he gets where he needs to be. He's involved in his church and some of the church ministries. He just mentioned the other day he's starting to train on the soundboard at church, so the fact that he's getting involved in things, on a what would be considered a social basis is a good thing, and I think that'll be good for him in the long run. Do you want to cover this one? Okay.
I just want to reiterate, I think this issue, we've talked about this, but resource facilitation is a service. Clearly, Susie's done a lot of stuff here. But secondly, it's the integration and coordination of services. And so I think that this, brain injury takes a village. And so that's what resource facilitation is, to provide services, but it is to coordinate and time services in the right way. For this gentleman, as we've discussed, I think there's a next stage for this guy, fortunately, and fortunately it's not DOC. So the next stage now is to take a direct approach to dealing with his cognitive and neurobehavioral problems through some appropriate medicines and through some appropriate rehabilitative interventions, and also continued family education and involvement in that, so that they really get what's going on with him. So there is a next step to him, and then resource facilitation is what promotes and guides and leads people through those steps to get them to successful employment and sustaining that employment. So it's Cecilia, it's Susie, it's the job specialist, it's the neuropsychologist. From the clinical perspective, it's the family. It's pulling all that together that's relevant, and that's not easy to do with all of our day-to-day realities, but that's what resource facilitation is about. And so So I think that's why this guy is moving down the course as he has. We have I do have some, I was going to insert some more information in here. These next two slides are actually in air, or they're not in there. I didn't have the time to finalize them. We do have a proposal out to work between the Brain Injury Association and the Department of Corrections, and we're working on getting that moving. So hopefully that will happen at some point. Want to thank all of you for your participation. We've got some time for questions. If others have some, please fire away at your keyboard there.
I'll just one good thing with Tom and educating his family is he's very open to me calling them. I mean, he'll often, just the other day, I think he thought his mom was mad, so that's one of the first things he calls me. Will you call my mom? So he's very open to me educating his family, and that makes it easy. You know, not everybody wants you to talk to their family and to be open about it, but he is open about his brain injury, and it makes it easier in getting that education across to family members.
Yeah, I see someone is typing away there. So I think we're going to have a question here in a minute. If anyone else has questions, please feel free to start flying away at it. And to one other issue, I don't know where we are with plans for future webinars, if those issues have been discussed. Oh, yeah, so we do have them. So, yeah. Okay. So we've got one scheduled on June 12 and September 11. Oh, that's, yeah, so I don't know about 9/11, but so I'll have to come up with a special topic on that one. And then November 6th, our future webinars. So, well, I don't see any other questions come in. I thought I saw someone typing away there. But thank you very much for your time as always, and we will look forward to chatting in June with all of you. Someone is open. We do have people typing. Sorry. Lori Wilkerson, can you give me those dates again? I'll be happy to. June 12 at 1 to 3. September 11, 1 to 3. And November 6, 12:30 to 3:30. I don't know why that's 3 hours, but maybe that's an error. But certainly on November 6. So that's the information I have available. I'm sure Carol Straw Bradley will send out announcements on that as well. So, and I see messages coming in from Karen Smith. Oh, multiple attendees are typing. Okay, hello, multiple attendees. Thank you for your input. Oh, okay. Okay, yeah, thanks. We're getting some nice feedback from you people out there. We appreciate that very much. And in the interim, you know, if you have questions or concerns or anything, just get a hold of Susie Crane or Tina Funkhauser in Fort Wayne, or me or whoever. Karen Smith has got a question here. If you do not have access to resource facilitation in your area, any suggestion on finding a neuropsychologist willing to test and work with VR? So that's a complex question, Karen. We are talking with the state about how to grow resource facilitation throughout the state. Certainly the state wants that. Part of that is helping identify neuropsychologists throughout the state. that know how to do this and know how to work with resource facilitation, know how to make meaningful recommendations for the vocational rehabilitation process. So I don't know what part of the world you're in, Karen. If you can tell me where you are, I might know somebody. You're also, for those of you who have questions, my email address is lance.trexler, Trexler, at R as in rehabilitation, H as in hospital, I as in Indiana, N as in network.com. So you're welcome to fire me questions about neuropsychologist. Hi Karen, Southwest Indiana. So in Southwest Indiana, there is the nearest neuropsychologist that would either, there's someone in Evansville I know. There's a person there that is quite good at rehabilitation related issues, and there's one that's not his specialty. And I can't think of the person's name. Yeah, so Dr. Gray does some testing. And there's another person there who is really quite. You know what? If you will send me an email, Karen, I will facilitate access to someone down there. I can't. It's a woman, and I can't think of her name, but I will find it. Yeah, send me an email. That'd be great. Okay. I think that's it, folks. Looks like Denise is typing something. Hi, Denise. Thank you. It's very interesting to see what resource facilitation can do for our consumers, right? I look forward to seeing a resource facilitator in Region 4 Area 25 someday. I know we are across the river from Louisville, but some consumers see the wall of China. Yeah. Yeah, so I know. We really want to help you too, Denise. You know, this all got started with our HRSA grant, and so we've rolled it out in 3 different sites, Fort Wayne, Indianapolis, and Bloomington. We want to do it as much as you folks want it, and so hopefully we'll be bridging those gaps in the near future, or crossing the wall of China, as you put it. So thanks again for your time all, and have a great week, and we'll talk to you in June. All the best. Bye-bye.